Representative Duncan. Oh, good morning and welcome to day 2 of corporations. I trust everybody had an enjoyable evening and made it back. Still, I think we're down 2 members and we're waiting on 2 more to link in this morning. So as we kind of slowly dust off, I don't think we need another roll call. Up first this morning is housing issues. As soon as I get my agenda pulled up. Anyone have any opening statements or questions from yesterday? Seeing none. All right, first up, Josh, or who gets the privilege to present this morning? Kelly, welcome. Ms. Lomer, it's all yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, committee. My name is Kelly Lower. I'm an associate research analyst with the LSO, and I'm going to be running through a research memo on other states' housing authorities and fair housing enforcement. I've also included a short description of state housing trust. Short. Is this better? I've also included a short description of state housing trust funds and their administering agencies, and an overview of a few middle-income housing funding initiatives in surrounding states. The first 3 sections on pages 1 through 3 describe the various forms of state housing agencies in other states. In Appendix A, you'll find a list of 25 state housing agencies and their agency description. This is not an exhaustive list, but an overview of various types of state housing agencies. The first category on page 1 is state housing finance agencies, or HFAs. Every state has an HFA. Most are quasi-governmental agencies or instrumentalities of the state, such as Wyoming's HFA, the Wyoming Community Development Authority, or WCDA. A few states run their HFA as an independent state agency, examples being Minnesota and South Carolina. HFAs are typically self-funded through the sale of tax-exempt mortgage revenue bonds. Many HFAs administer federal housing programs like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program and the National Housing Trust Fund. The second category of state housing agencies are housing departments and divisions. These are typically more robust state agencies and provide policy guidance, regulation activities, fair housing education and training programs, as well as housing development funding programs. Some states have a standalone department like Arizona. Other states have a housing division within another department like Colorado and Montana. As previously mentioned, Appendix A includes these housing agencies and their organization and state government. Third category of state housing agencies, beginning on page 3, the bottom of page 2, are state public housing agencies. The term public housing agencies refers to agencies established to implement the 1937 federal low-rent public housing program. Some states, like Arizona, have a state public housing agency within their state housing department. Others, like Vermont, have a state public housing agency that is an instrumentality of the state or quasi-governmental agency with a similar organizational structure to WCDA. The fourth section on page 3 is a brief overview of housing trust funds. 47 states have a state housing trust fund. A list is provided in Appendix B, along with the trust fund's administering agency. State housing trust funds collect revenue to finance the development of affordable housing in their state. The most common source of revenue for state housing trust funds are real estate transfer taxes. Most state housing trust funds are administered by a state housing finance agency like the WCDA. The fifth section, starting on page 3, is an overview of recent middle-income housing funding initiatives in surrounding states. Colorado, South Dakota, and Nebraska have established or funded housing programs targeted towards middle-income individuals. Middle income is commonly referred to as those within the 80 to 120% area median income range. Most of these programs provide loans or grants for the development of middle-income housing or infrastructure. However, Colorado's middle-income housing program is unique in that this was created in the 2022 session and will develop, own, and maintain middle-income multifamily rental properties. These initiatives have a variety of funding mechanisms, including bond financing, state appropriations, and ARPA fiscal recovery funds. My last section, starting on page 5, is a description of fair housing enforcement agencies and their organization in state governments. Enforcement of the Federal Fair Housing Act is conducted by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. State fair housing enforcement agencies that enforce state fair housing acts with similar protections to that of the Federal Fair Housing Act they may receive certification from the HUD through their Fair Housing Assistance Program. Once certified by the Fair Housing Assistance Program with substantial equivalent certification, state fair housing enforcement agencies will be referred all fair housing complaints filed with HUD within their jurisdiction. Certified agencies are eligible to receive funding and training opportunities from HUD to carry out their duties. Using resources from the FHAP, LSO identified 34 states with a fair housing enforcement agency partnered with the FHAP and 2 states with local agencies partnered with the FHAP. These are provided in Appendix C. Of these states, 2 have a fair housing enforcement office within the Attorney General's office, Arizona and Louisiana. 22 have a Human Rights Commission enforcing their fair housing laws, such as Nebraska. And while most state housing agencies clarify their dedication to compliance with fair housing laws, no agencies researched enforce these laws. LSO was not able to ascertain why state housing agencies do not enforce fair housing acts. However, this could be due to a conflict arising from the possibility of an agency self-policing. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Lower. That's very good. Besides, I realize I don't have LexisNexis on my computer, so all the hyperlinks for all your references I can't pull up quickly, but we'll work on that in the future because I'm probably the only person who clicks on sites. I do have a question. I think it's on Colorado's Middle Income Housing Authority. If you know, they seem from the memo, what I can quickly gather is that the entity, it's not a government entity, but it's a nonprofit, public, some kind of corporation, but they own the land and maybe own the buildings, and that's how they provide affordable housing because the tenants aren't actually in possession of the property long-term.
Correct. They are rental properties that are owned by the authority, and the authority is a body corporate political subdivision.
With no affiliation with the government, so I get, yeah. I just always heard, my entire kind of background is you build wealth by actually owning a home and I'm paying it off, and then you have an asset to leave, and that's how you create generational wealth. So, it seems like a great idea, but it seems perhaps not the way I would think we would want to go. Other questions? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, I apologize if this is Kelly's not the right person to answer the question, but the question I would pose is, and maybe it was answered at the previous meeting, and I was on Zoom, and it was a little intermittent, and just missed it. But traditionally, one of the ways that affordable housing has been furnished has been through mobile homes, manufactured housing, and mobile homes, however you want to call them, house trailers. I've got a significant trailer park in my district. And those seem to be going, they don't seem to be expanding, that doesn't seem to be used anymore. Is there been any, why are we not seeing more of those? Are there restrictions being placed on them? What's happening there?
Ms. Laura, if you know.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, I'd be happy to look into that more for you. It's a bit beyond the scope of this project, but I can get back to you on that. I do know that some state housing departments regulate mobile homes, manufactured homes, factory-built homes, et cetera, for their state. So I can probably find some more information on that for you.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, and the real question, maybe some other witnesses will be able to fill me in. Are we doing some regulatory things that are discouraging the use of those? That's what I'm a little afraid of. So it's more a question of what are we doing here?
And so maybe this is an unfair question, but as you've done this research and looked through other states and kind of put them into 4 categories, in your mind, was there anything that said, hey, this actually would work for Wyoming? Maybe we could have, I guess I'm just looking for some direction. I know as a research person, we're the policymakers, but if you did have any thoughts of, this is actually pretty innovative and interesting and could work for a state like Wyoming, we'd certainly be, I think, pleased to hear any opinions you have on maybe where we should be taking this.
Mr. Chairman, that's an excellent question. I would have to defer possibly to our staff attorneys because that might come up in statute, some issues with statute. But as far as what our current housing finance agency, the WCDA, could do, but I would be happy to look into that more for you and give you a more concise answer.
Maybe let me follow a bit. Does it seem like we're doing as much as other states, or are we drastically behind the curve and everybody else is way ahead on kind of these issues and where they've gone, or are we still in the middle of the pack and everybody has the same struggle?
Mr. Chairman, based off my research, I think we could be doing more.
Other questions this morning for Kelly at this time? And welcome Representative Duncan. All right, seeing none. Committee, any questions on the memo? We can throw it to our attorneys as well. Not seeing any, but we'll certainly use it as reference as we proceed through this morning. Thank you very much. Next up, I guess we're gonna probably jump right into the Housing Trust Fund bill that our committee discussed and asked for draft at our last meeting. It's my understanding that even though 47 states have them, it seems just a little more complicated with our current constitution than we originally believed. And so Ms. Johnson has put together another memo for us with the constitutional issues we have in doing housing trust funds, and would please to turn it over to Anna to walk us through the next memo in your packet, and then let us throw some questions at her on if we want to try to get innovative in getting around our constitution or how we can move forward with our current prohibitions in place. Good morning, Ms. Johnson.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I have a memo here entitled Housing Trust Fund Bill Draft, Constitutional Issues. At the last meeting, this committee directed LSO staff to craft a bill based on Iowa's Housing Trust Fund statutes. Iowa's Housing Trust Fund is funded primarily from legislative appropriation and provides awards to entities providing low-income housing to Iowa communities. This memorandum provides information on potential legal challenges that may arise if a similar bill draft is enacted. For instance, there are constitutional prohibitions against the state or its political subdivisions loaning, giving credit, or making donations to people or entities in certain situations. There's a constitutional prohibition against legislative appropriations for charitable or industrial purposes unless the recipient is under the control of the state. And simply copying Iowa's Housing Trust Fund model could be problematic because of the way our trust funds are typically laid out and because of these constitutional issues. And just so the committee is aware, this is just a brief overview and is not meant to be comprehensive. As to the Wyoming constitutional issues, Article 3, Section 36 prohibits legislative appropriations for charitable or industrial purposes unless the recipient is under the control of the state. And then Article 16, Section 6 prohibits the state and its political subdivisions from loaning or giving credit to guarantee private obligations, and also prohibits these actors from making donations to private individuals or entities, except for the necessary support of the poor. For instance, there is some case law regarding these issues. In Frank versus City of Cody, the Supreme Court held that the constitutional prohibition against a municipality lending its credit to a private corporation has no application when there is an exchange of consideration between the parties. So in other words, consideration can either be strictly monetary or a public benefit to the state. There is no case law that states what may constitute adequate consideration, but courts do give deference to legislative determinations, and the more consideration the state receives in return, the less likely an appropriation for workforce housing and economic development would violate the donations clause.
So Ms. Johnson, Senator Nethercutt threw her hand up, so I'm
Okay.
guessing she might want to throw a question at you right now, just in case. Senator Nethercutt?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. As you recall, I'm the one that made the motion at the last meeting, and I guess I'm a bit surprised for purposes of this meeting that we're simply receiving a memo concerning the constitutional prohibition of the state appropriating funds to private entities. I think that's something that this committee is well aware of, and was actually expecting a bill draft to be seen for this meeting that contemplated what was directed to by the committee that would be constitutional, or at least a staff comment within the bill draft identifying the concerns associated in the memo. Now we don't even have a bill draft to work. And I am very disappointed by this outcome. And I think that there are multiple ways around this constitutional concern, again, which I think that this committee is well aware of, which could be the WCDA as a starting point for how that could work. And would just like to express those concerns to the committee about being further behind with having a solution concerning this statewide issue that I think all of us broad-based have experienced within our own communities and districts. So very concerned about where we go from here.
So, Senator Nethercutt, I will take some of that blame. And so LSO did reach out to the co-chairman and I about a month ago and said this is a little more in depth than we thought. It would be a simple, cut and paste of Iowa with some updates. And so they did call us and we sat down and said, the bill draft is going to look extensive and have a lot of staff notes and is going to basically express that we have constitutional provisions to get around. And so it was somewhat my call that said, well, let's take a smaller step, say what are all the constitutional issues we have, and make sure the committee in understanding those was still ready to move forward. So I will take some blame for encouraging LSO to not start the larger draft that was contemplated, so we could really work through these issues as a committee and make sure everybody felt comfortable enough to, I shouldn't say work around the Constitution, but find ways within our constitutional structure to address some of the concerns that are going to be brought up here. So it is a smaller step than contemplated, but I guess I personally thought it was important that we fully understand some of the implications when we start jumping into the government and housing, that we're on the same page of what we're jumping into. So for everyone on the committee, I do share the concern, and it was at my direction that we moved a little slower. But with that, Ms. Johnson, keep going, and
Okay.
then we'll see if we can speed up between now and the next meeting on what this committee is looking for.
She's got her hand up.
Senator Nethercutt, go ahead.
Thank you for the follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I appreciate you taking responsibility for that, and certainly expected that to be the answer as a fellow chairman as well. I guess to get to the point, rather than taking the committee's time to understand the constitutional prohibition that, again, I think we're all aware of, perhaps to have LSO walk us through how the Wyoming Community Development Authority is not violating the Constitution through the programs that it offers through housing opportunities, from direct appropriations from the state, or perhaps the Wyoming Business Council, or all of the other state organizations that we have that does do state appropriations that eventually make it into private hands. So perhaps let's walk through maybe some of those pathways so we can identify actual solutions here in front of us instead of just can't move forward.
Nice. I guess I certainly agree with that. And while I appreciate the thought that we're all on the same page on the basics, I guess as a chairman, I always want to make sure not only the committee, but also members of the public who've reached out and are concerned are on the same page as the committee, that there is a substantial background that we need to be aware of before we move forward. So, but after we get through our memo, if you could address some of the WCDA, and I know they're here as well, on how they do operate within the constitutional framework and the bounds. So I'll let you continue for now, and then hopefully we'll transition that discussion into how we currently do some economic development opportunities in conjunction with the Constitution.
Okay.
Unless Senator Scott wants to jump in. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to serve notice that at some point, and this is not the appropriate time, I'm going to want to talk about can we solve some of this problem by removing some of the governmental obstacles to development of housing?
Okay.
All right, go ahead.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the constitutional amendment in Article 16, Section 12 began as a statutory bill draft in the 1980s. The programs contemplated in the bill draft were meant to encourage economic development within the state. The Attorney General issued an informal opinion stating that such a statutory change would create unconstitutional grant and loan programs. So the legislature passed it as a constitutional amendment instead, specifying that only earmarked funds appropriated by a 2/3 vote of the legislature could be used for the program. And then in Witzenberger versus State, the Wyoming Supreme Court held that the Wyoming Community Development Authority's practice of lending state money to mortgage lenders or lending of the public credit for a private purpose was not unconstitutional so long as no debt was created in the state beyond the current year's taxes. And then finally, for case law, in State v. Carter, the Supreme Court held that if a grant or loan could be construed as a donation without adequate consideration or not for a public purpose, it could be found unconstitutional. And then there have been some formal Attorney General opinions, and in one of those, the Attorney General's office has implemented a 3-part test that has to be resolved for a program to pass constitutional muster. First, the economic development project must be recognized as a legitimate public purpose. Second, the economic development must be recognized as adequate consideration for the funding. And third, statutory authority must exist for the economic development funding. It has to be noted that an incidental public good is not enough. It has to be fairly comprehensive. And it's also important to note that the difference between a market interest rate and a low interest rate can amount to a donation. Finally, providing funds to political subdivisions of the state through loans or grants does not violate the constitutional prohibition on making donations or on making appropriations to entities not under the absolute control of the state. And then there are a few existing programs in Wyoming that could potentially help with the housing shortage, as well as provide a helpful framework for how a workforce housing program could be modeled. First off, the Wyoming Business Ready Community Program was created to promote economic development by creating additional economic health and a stronger state economy. Grants and loans can be made for economic development or educational development, planning or infrastructure projects, including the purchase of land, buildings, facilities, and other infrastructure. The program doesn't target workforce housing directly, but provides a helpful framework for how such a program could be structured. The grants and loans can only be provided to governmental entities or political subdivisions of the state, and no grants or loans can be made without the written opinion of the Attorney General certifying the legality of the transaction. Second, we have the Wyoming Workforce Housing Infrastructure Program, which was created to facilitate workforce housing in order to provide the economic welfare, to promote the economic welfare of the state by increasing employment and stimulating economic activity. The program is meant to benefit all citizens of Wyoming, and it provides loans for the creation of infrastructure for workforce housing, subdivisions, or developments. And then the infrastructure must also be publicly owned and does not include the building of actual houses, thus avoiding several constitutional issues. And then we also have the Wyoming Community Development Authority Act, which was created for essentially the same reasons as the Workforce Housing Infrastructure Program, and it provides low-interest mortgage loans and education for Wyoming families. It also provides down payment assistance, and all assistance is in loan form. So in conclusion, a state-created housing trust fund could be found unconstitutional if the funds awarded amount to donations. However, case law contemplates that adequate consideration can be exchanged when loaning and potentially granting state funds for a public purpose, even if the exchange incidentally benefits private individuals. And statutory trust funds exist in Wyoming where the corpus is generated from multiple sources and are aimed at benefiting the state as a whole. There are also existing programs in Wyoming that could be reviewed for their potential to assist with the workforce housing shortage. And I would stand for any questions.
All right, any questions, committee? Seeing none at this time, perhaps you could, and I don't know if you are the right person, but the WCDA, and talk about how when they were created, they do have an arena in which they operate that is within constitutional bounds. If you could expand on that.
Right. I believe the WCDA operates within a certain income limit to begin with. And then it also fits the Attorney General's three-part test for whether or not such a program would be constitutional, such as the project is recognized as a legitimate public purpose, and there's adequate consideration for the funding, which can be monetary or just a public benefit to the state. And so providing avenues for more affordable housing could be seen as a legitimate public purpose. And then obviously there's statutory authority that allows the WCDA to operate. And I could answer any other questions on that note.
Mr. Chairman, I've always looked at the necessary support of the poor in 16.6 and said that by and large, if you have some kind of a income or means test or asset test, something of that nature in there that is somewhat realistic given the magnitude of the expense that some of the families are facing, that probably met the necessary support of the poor test. Is that an accurate way of looking at that?
I believe that you're probably right. If we have some sort of a threshold or something along those lines, I suppose that could be seen as creating a benefit for the poor, necessary support of the poor.
Further questions, committee? Well, I guess don't go too far.
I won't.
We'll call you back up should we jump back into the topic here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Johnson.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Senator Nethercott, go ahead.
Hey, thank you. So I guess what I would say is in light of so stand by closely would be my suggestion. And in light of the testimony that we received in May, and I believe the support of the move for a bill draft by this committee to identify the solution, how do we make a program similar to Iowa's constitutional? So that's the question that I have for Ms. Olson. Based on the will of the committee, how do we make the will of the committee constitutional? What suggestions do you have in order to do that?
And I do have some suggestions, and thank you for asking. So Iowa's trust fund model in reading their statutes, it would appear that they could award entities that aren't necessarily political subdivisions of the state with grants or loans, and that might cause problems in Wyoming because we shouldn't, well, constitutionally, loaning credit or giving credit to private entities would cause a problem. And so if we're just giving money to political subdivisions to create this housing, political subdivisions of the state, county, cities, towns, that could avoid that problem. We also have to make sure that there's adequate consideration that obviously a public benefit is being met. And so affordable housing could meet that criteria. It might also be important to have a legislative findings section just saying why we're creating this program and the benefits that it would give to the state. But I think as long as there's adequate consideration and we're giving these loans or grants to political subdivisions, I think you avoid a lot of constitutional issues just by doing that.
And so there is a way forward to draft a bill that we do believe would meet constitutional muster to enable a statewide housing trust fund.
I think that there is. I think it might also be, one way that it could be done is basing it sort of on the model of the Business Ready Community Program, which obviously we already have. And if we base it on that and then maybe just create the program for workforce housing, I think that would be a way to do this as well. And then I think the most important thing in the Business Ready Community Program is that no grants or loans can be made without the written opinion of the Attorney General regarding the legality of the loan or grant. And I think if we put a subsection in there about that, I think that would be helpful as well.
I do appreciate how you're teeing up the Business Council in just a second. Representative Duncan, then we'll go to Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I'm very frustrated because I thought that was the direction we were already saying we were going. That was my intent, because then this would already be teeing up communities to partner, private public partnerships to be able to solve this issue, giving them the resources, but having them be able to solve these issues together as a team. So that would be my recommendation. I wish we would already have this in place, because that was the whole idea of this. That was the whole idea of kind of going in the direction, at least my intent was going towards the Wyoming Business Council, because they already have this in place with the Business Ready, the BRCs. So that was my intent. That was my direction when I originally was talking about this. And that was the idea, is for the communities who are affected by this to force them, if they want funds, if they want help, then the private and the government, or the private and the public, have to work together in order to receive funds, in order to move forward. Because that seems to be the barrier, is the private's willing to do it, but the public's not willing to participate, or the public's willing to do it, but they don't have the funds. So this is a perfect solution to be able to have both parties work together. That was my understanding. So correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm my last day. So thank you.
Oh, it's
No question. Do you agree?
hopefully it's not your last day, because we have a meeting in October and some more stuff going on. But I think the ultimate question is, what are the resources available and how do we get there in the framework? And we're all pushing, I think, in the same direction. And we'll hear from the Business Council in a second. But Ms. Johnson, if you did have any thoughts.
I do have a couple thoughts regarding Iowa's statute, because it was our direction that we were supposed to be basing this off of Iowa's statute. And the difficulty with that is their trust fund model is totally different from the models in Wyoming. And it seems that they're giving money to private entities, which causes a lot of issues regarding Wyoming's constitution. And so that's kind of how we ended up where we are now. But I think with a little more direction, we'll have a bill draft for the October meeting.
Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, there was some discussion at the Hewlett meeting, and it was, I think, somewhat inconclusive. What I've heard is that one of the real ways we could work on this is to provide more in the way of the water sewer infrastructure and make construction of low-income housing privately more attractive by providing more of the infrastructure. And I think that's something the committee ought to explore. And the question I've got for you, if we do that, are we proper under section 1610 of the Constitution in the development, because it is an extension of, really would be an extension of the water development program to provide for these purposes, the water development in much closer to the actual users and construct a fair amount of that. Is that a route we can constitutionally explore given 1610?
If you know off the top of your head, that's our water improvements on how we engage in internal improvements for operations, construction of water.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Scott, I believe the Business Ready Community Program already does something similar to that. I would have to look a little bit closer at that particular constitutional.
So, Mr. Chairman, following up, if I may then, one of the possibilities there would be an expansion of the Business Ready program in that particular area for this particular purpose.
Wouldn't you agree?
I do believe that you could amend the Business Ready Community Program to allow for that.
I just find it fascinating when we wrote our Constitution and have this section, right? For those of you who don't know, we copied like 95% of our Constitution from 3 other states. But all of our Rocky Mountain states, the Dakotas, Nebraska as well, all had these very similar language to ours. But 6 states have updated, including Iowa, Colorado. So they've gone through this and said, hey, it's different than we were in the 1870s to 1890s. We just haven't amended our Constitution to be as innovative in these areas now that the world has changed. So those of you who haven't been here long enough, this has been the section maybe twice a year, every year, for as long as I've been here, that stops us from doing, well, certain activities and bills that people have requested. So it is a difficult section to continue to work with, and I think at some point in the future, we will work on if there's a more updated way to our Constitution to allow for projects. And we have done that, I think, with the Business Council in 2003, and Senator Scott's been here much longer, so he might want to add into that conversation. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, what you're telling me is that 16.6 is an effective barrier on the expansion of the government.
Hear, hear.
It is. Further questions for Ms. Johnson? Seeing none. Thank you much. With that,
Was that fun?
it'll be more fun in October. Business Council, thank you for coming all the way up from Cheyenne and Laramie. Morning, Ron. Morning, Josh. Thank you for being here, and the floor is yours when you're ready.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Thanks for having us here today. As all of you know, and as was said in the previous committee meeting, this is a complex topic. And so one of the things that I thought I could do today, my name is Josh Farrell, I'm the CEO of the Business Council. Joining me today is Ron Goldberg, who's our Strategic Partnerships Director. And I guess what I thought I would do today is just take a quick step back and remember and remind where the Business Council plays today, because I think it's important to note where we play today so that that can be understood in the context of the bigger problem that we're trying to solve, as well as understand what might need to happen in order for us to solve a larger portion of this problem. So as all of you know, one of the key things that the Business Council is engaged in, especially today, is really retaining, expanding, and recruiting businesses in our communities so that they can create resilient communities, so that we're not as susceptible to the ups and downs of the economy. Maybe many of you have felt those in our life here in Wyoming. And so to do that, especially over the past couple of years, we've been very, very careful to look at businesses that bring in jobs that are high above the median wage, which may not be what you might qualify for affordable housing in some of those cases. So remember that and consider that. And also remember that we are focused on building that community capacity with projects, whether it be infrastructure, as has been mentioned before, or buildings that the city or the local economic development organization can utilize to build their capacity and in some ways work ourselves out of a job. Because it would be a great thing if all of our communities were so powerful in their economic development and had the capacity, both money and infrastructure, that we weren't necessary. I think that would probably raise a cheer from what I've heard for a little less government. I think we could all appreciate that. While that's a very far off perhaps thing to do, that is our scope. And it's something that we look very, very narrowly at right now. And that focus has enabled us to create in the last few years some real exciting activity. Now, I don't want to argue the point that housing is a problem, because it is a problem. I don't want to argue the point that companies that are looking to expand and keep their workforce, or companies that are looking to come to Wyoming, don't look at the housing inventory and say, is there enough? I don't want to argue those points because they're real. But I want to, I guess, illuminate the idea of this chicken and the egg problem that we seem to think we have. And remember that when you want to fix a problem like that, you have to focus on one area and create pressure that will then cause a problem in the other area big enough to solve. Now, this is all probably not making a whole lot of sense, so I'll be really, really plain. Right now, the Business Council's job is to create a housing problem. And I say that in all seriousness, and I don't mean to be flippant about it, but it is actually our job to create an environment where businesses can thrive, where businesses can grow. And housing is one component of it. But ultimately, it's our job to create the pressure that creates a housing problem. And if we stay focused on that, we can create enough pressure, we can create enough of a housing problem that will make us attractive to developers, so that more of the idea of an ideal market, which is, we could debate that on another day, but that market forces would drive development in our communities. Now, again, that's where we're focused right now. We have many examples. I think there's a portion of our state in the Southwest that is showing that there is so much expansion there that the pressure is rising. That's not necessarily because of the things that we've done, but that is happening. In other communities, we're creating that pressure with some of the projects that we do. We want to continue to create that pressure. Now, we don't want to just create the problem and not have any solutions for it. But I can tell you right now, that's where our focus is creating that problem, where there are businesses who are here or who come here and struggle to find housing. Because to me, that's the first thing you do. You don't build it and then they'll come. You create the problem and then you solve that one. Can't solve them all at once. So we're going to do it in that stepwise fashion. Now, again, we don't want to be the place that just comes in, creates a problem, and then walks away. We do actually have, and it was mentioned before, and I think it's important to note that the Business Ready Communities program can be utilized for housing developments. it can be utilized with private developers, with communities, to develop the infrastructure that maybe makes it economical, that makes it ready for that development, so that it is attractive to a developer to do so. Now, that program doesn't have a ton of money. That program doesn't have all of the things that it necessarily needs, especially in terms of funding, to be able to accomplish that everywhere we go. The ideal situation is that we utilize our Business Ready Community program to build a building for a company that is either expanding or relocating to a town. And as we do that, we say, hey, it turns out that housing is going to be needed as well. And ideally, we could then utilize that Business Ready Communities program to put in the infrastructure, as Senator Scott mentioned, to make it attractive to the developer and make it economical for the developer to do what they need to do. Because again, it's not that I like to mess with the market, but you have to, because it turns out that other states do. And so if you ask developers, where do they want to develop? They want to develop where it's easiest regulatory. They want to develop where they can get their permitting and all of that done fast. And they want to develop in a place where they're going to make money. Well, in some ways, we're not that because of some of those barriers. We can fix some of them.
Hey, while you're right there, all the hands are popping up online, so let me throw some questions at you.
Thank you.
We'll let Senator, we'll hope you thank me. Senator Nethercutt, go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think Mr. Dorrell's doing a great job, and I'll have some questions of him when he's finished, because he's working through it.
Same, Representative Duncan, or do you want to throw one out now?
No, I'll throw one out right now.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh, I have a quick question. How many times have you had companies come to you that wanted to relocate here, but because there wasn't adequate housing, they looked elsewhere?
Mr. Dorrell, if you know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Representative Duncan. I appreciate that question because, again, as I mentioned, it is a challenge, right? And especially in some communities. What I will tell you is that it is one of the challenges that those businesses face when they're relocating. They face a similar challenge in other areas as well. There's no doubt. Maybe not as big a challenge. It is a challenge, but I can't say with 100% certainty that it is the challenge that stopped them. I have just as much data from people who are developing and who are expanding in Wyoming that there are other challenges that they face that they want us to help them fix, and that housing is one that they are willing to work on with us and provide their planning period from now until 6-7 years from now when they're going to be doing this work to work with us. Now, Representative Duncan, I think it's a very fair question. And what I would say is that we like to look at these communities not as a blanket statement across the state, but as an individual situation and community. Because we have the Business Ready Communities program, we can engage and help developments happen. And there have been some examples, they haven't gone anywhere in my time, but there have been a couple examples already either explored or brought forth to the council for housing developments. So we can do those. So I guess my point, Representative Duncan, is that there are times when people say, well, there doesn't seem like there's enough housing for our company to be here. But there are also those times when those companies say, we are expanding, can we work together so that there is housing for our community? So it's sort of a balance, I guess.
Follow up?
Follow up, and then we'll go to Senator Bone after that. Go ahead, Representative
Thank
Duncan.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Josh, quick question, follow up with that. So do we have an issue of maybe marketing or getting the information out there? Because this is the first time I'm hearing about being able to use the BRC for housing. So do you see that as a possible issue that we're not getting the message out there?
Go ahead.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Duncan, that's a fair point, perhaps. Our regional directors, all that are spread throughout the state, all know about that. And again, like I've said, in my 2.5 years with the Business Council, I've seen one project come to the council that is a housing development project. I've also been involved in some what you might call almost like a trade mission to a housing fabricator to look at that and to address housing. So I don't know if it's something that we stand on the rooftops and scream out, but we look at it as what is the constraint to growth, or what is the economic key that's going to unlock that in a community. So we have it as a tool, and sure, it could be a marketing problem. But at the same time, it has been used and known in my time.
Senator Bonner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's basically what my question was. Just be helpful for me if we understood precisely how many times has actually been utilized, not discussed, but utilized the Business Ready Community Program for housing, and if there are any barriers that you see, even statutory barriers. Obviously, that's something we could help with. So if you have to answer that right now, that'd be great, but certainly understand if you follow up as well.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Bonner, that's a great question. We can develop that. I think we can easily comb through our records and find the number of times that those were recommended by our board and approved by SLIB and then put into place. The number of times that those might have come before us, we might take a little more digging, but I can definitely get the numbers on what has actually happened in that area. I think that could be useful. I don't have that today, but I can prepare it. Absolutely. Good question. Thank you.
All right, sorry to stop in the middle of your presentation. Oh, Representative Roscoe, also you have a question?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Josh, I was just curious if when you're looking for companies to come to a community and looking at the restraints that might be there, or maybe encouragement for a community to attract companies. Do you ever hear these companies mentioning, having really good education and really good highways and sort of infrastructure, hospitalization, all stuff like that? Is that something you hear from these companies that maybe want to move to our communities? And we happen to have, we happen to have a real problem with all that in my community because of housing. We can't keep teachers, snowplow drivers, or doctors and nurses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead, Mr. Dorr.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Roscoe. That's a good question as well. I really haven't heard. Well, you mentioned snowplow drivers. No one has ever mentioned snowplow drivers as a reason to not move to that town. Said with a bit of sarcasm, I apologize. But your other points are really are well taken, but they've never been mentioned because some of those things, quite frankly, are really, they're taken for granted. And I don't mean that in a bad way, but we sort of assume a certain level. Now, I will say that we do talk a lot about school funding in Wyoming and how our schools are funded and how our classrooms are not overcrowded in most cases, and that we have that. That is important to companies as they move in. I think the business climate as a whole tends to be much more attractive to where they maybe don't even look at those factors as much. Again, because they assume that they're at least on a level playing field. So those are areas in recruitment that we don't hear about a ton. We hear in the recruiting efforts that we're part of, we definitely hear about business climate. We hear about workforce availability and training. We hear about housing. We hear about the regulatory environment and the tax structure. All of those things fit together, and it really just depends upon the individual situation, which one might sort of stand out more than another.
Okay, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, if you will indulge the chairman of the Education Committee for just a moment.
You will.
You mentioned education, and I wasn't quite clear. That is something that as you're recruiting a business, they do look at.
Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Senator Scott, yes, absolutely. You know, people do think about schools and they think about how that goes. I can't quantify how often that happens, but I can tell you that as a company comes in, they want to understand the school system. And I think they also want to understand just how our school system performs, what are the class sizes. They think about that. Now, I will tell you that in a lot of cases, they make an assumption. They make an assumption that where they're coming from is probably not as good as where they're coming to. And that's because we do tend to have smaller towns with smaller class sizes and things like that.
Go ahead, yeah.
Mr. Chairman. So the point I would make is that I think we are funding the schools well, but I don't think we're getting what we're paying for in terms of performance. And I'm hoping we're going to be able to work on that and improve our reputation. And I hope it'll help you in the future. But the funding is there. Is it being translated? No, not as much as it needs to be.
Mr. Chairman, just to address Senator Scott's comment, I'm glad you didn't say, would you agree? Because I would have to say, I don't know. But what I can tell you is thank you for thinking about school performance, because I do think that will help us in the future. And again, I think in some ways we're not quite there yet in our recruiting maturity and the ecosystem that we're building. We're still at the very early stages. And so as that becomes more, I think, more mature, we're going to have those kinds of questions, and the companies that will be approaching us will really care. So I'm glad that you're working on that as well. Thank you.
Go ahead.
If I may, I would make the point. I think our school systems are doing a very good job with the best and the brightest students. Those kids can be very impressive. I think there are problems where they're leaving behind a significant portion of the kids that aren't in that category that we don't need to leave behind, and that does affect the quality of workforce. And so that's where I'm hoping we're going to be able to do some work and improvement.
Thank you, sir.
Senator Nethercott, jump on in.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you to Mr. Dorrell. I want to make it clear my position as a member of this committee that I support your efforts to make housing a problem for the rest of Wyoming as a result of increasing job opportunities and workforce. So I believe the rest of the committee joins me in that the role of the Wyoming Business Council is to continue developing businesses and support those business efforts. But I also appreciate your acknowledgement of how accessible housing is part of that analysis for ensuring that we have additional job opportunities in the state. But I think really why the Business Council might be at the table for us here this morning, and to maybe help narrow down why we have their expertise in front of us, isn't necessarily related to business development or job growth, which is part of this conversation, but really as a solution to the constitutional challenges we've already heard. And I think the Business Council provides an example, a working example of how the state can appropriate dollars through a state organization to assist communities and private entities through the Business Ready Community Grants Program and other programs that the Business Council administers. And so my question to you more directly is, as a result of your experience with, for example, the Business Ready Community Grant or other programs the Business Council administers, do you believe that the solution moving forward for creating additional funding or additional programming for accessible or affordable housing should be within the Business Council? Or do you think the Wyoming Community Development Association or Authority or some other type of government entity is appropriate for moving forward this solution?
Go ahead, Mr. Dorr.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Nethercott, I think it's a great avenue because we have a program that could be utilized. I think it's a good way to think about that. And what I don't want to do is say no because. I would much rather say yes if. And so one of the things that I want to do is I want to make sure that we stay focused on our mission at the Business Council. And as you mentioned, it is really about, it is attracting, retaining, and really expanding the businesses in the state. And we do that not necessarily directly. We do that by building capacity at the local level with the local economic developers, with the towns themselves. And so while we do have this vehicle, I want to make sure that if we're going to broaden our scope to talk about affordable housing, because in most cases, what we're looking at are jobs that are created that are above, well above the median income in that area. That's one of the characteristics of projects that we fund that will create jobs above that median. So one thing I want to sort of caution folks about is that we are focused very heavily on bringing great jobs to a community. And we know that housing has a much broader spectrum that it looks at, and that's an important thing to do. And so I want to just let everyone know that as the Business Council sits today, we would not be the best place to look at that entire spectrum. Could we look at something slightly outside of the bounds of our program to do that? Yes. Could we look at the entire spectrum and do it justice? Today, no. So again, back to the idea of yes, if. What I think might work better is to utilize a program like the Business Ready Communities as it's intended to develop that housing or those housing developments that would support the types of businesses that we're trying to grow and unlock the economic impact that we could in a community, while in partnership with other organizations, and I don't want to speak for them, but while in partnership with other organizations to look at the entire spectrum. That's, as I see it today, that's the way I would look at it, is how do we take the programs that we have, perhaps broaden them a touch, but more than anything, make sure that they're well funded so that that we can take advantage of those moments in those communities, but not think about watering it down for the entire spectrum, because that's just not our focus.
With that, Representative Duncan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to just clarify some definitions here for people. Traditionally, everyone keeps using the word affordable housing, but we're not talking about affordable housing here. We're talking about attainable housing. There's a difference, because affordable housing in one place is totally different than places like Cody, Jackson, things like that. We're talking about attainable, something that people can actually get into housing, because it could be renting, it could be owning, it could be different things. So we're wanting attainable housing. So let's just caution, and everybody, please use the word attainable instead of affordable, because when you use the word affordable, you're thinking about low income. We're not talking about low income as Mr. Durrell's talking about. It could even be as high as your 250,000 could be middle housing. We're talking about across the nation. One of the things we're missing is middle housing. That's what's lost here. So it's attainable, not affordable. So that's just my 2 cents. I just wanted to make sure that people understood, as well as the public, to educate that we're talking about middle housing. Yes, we do have a lot of programs, a lot of programs out there for affordable housing, meaning your lower income. There's a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of houses and availability for low income. There's in Jackson and a lot of other places where people are moving in from out of state, and they're buying these upper income properties where there's complaints that it's driving our middle housing out. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the middle housing that's missing. So it's attainable housing that we're really focusing on and talking on. Wouldn't you agree?
Mr. Doral, if you have thoughts on the nomenclature, certainly happy to hear it, but we can move on to. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, and Representative Duncan, I think the complexity of the issue might be beyond my grasp right now, because we have been so focused on our current mission. So whether it's attainable or affordable, I don't have the answer there. I'm sure there's a percentage of AMI or something like that that we could talk about, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. Any other immediate questions before we let our CEO back to his presentation? I don't know if we took you out in the middle of your notes or any other thoughts on where we could go. And I mean, if there is not a current place for some of these initiatives that this committee is looking at in the business council, if there's a recommendation of where they would go or what capacity you would need to expand your mission, issues related to that.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I think we're at a spot where, and I think we've all said this in various ways. We have a program today that has it has constitutionality, plus it has the checks and balances to make sure that each of these projects are constitutional. I think that is something that we do have. I think we also have a program that can address, again, a certain band of the spectrum that we're talking about to unlock economic potential. And that means that as the pressure increases from the work that we're doing, we also have the ability to address that with infrastructure. That means water, sewer, curb and gutter, all of that really exciting stuff that civil engineers love so much. All of those things that could make a housing development equally economical to a developer that they might see in another state. Now, that's just one of the elements that we can provide. And I think that expanding that and having us have the capability, and what I mean by capability, I really mean more of funding, right? Our current funding levels are just not enough to do both. We can do one, but not the other, or some, but not all. And so I think that is an area where increasing the funding in the BRC program so that we are ready for those types of projects, again, when the economics are right, and again, that fit our model, I think makes sense. And of course, working with the others, because if you look at the Iowa State Housing Trust Fund, if we set a model for Wyoming, and you look at the eligible uses that are there, one of those 6 bullets relates to us as the business council. The other 5 don't really directly fit with us. And I think that would be the big challenge that we would have, is that we're talking 16% of the solution fits with us today. Everything else is outside of that. And so I think that's where we really want to stay focused so that we can have the biggest impact. And so working with the other agencies or other organizations like WCDA, that makes sense to us. We absolutely could do that. However, we just want to stay focused on that particular thing that we're starting to get really good at, and we're starting to create those problems. And again, we look at it as a little bit like private business. You don't solve every problem before you go out there. You solve one, and then it creates a couple more, and you solve those next. And we just keep stepping along and doing that. The BRC program right now can create and solve a portion of the housing problem. I hope that testimony helps, and it clarifies a little bit that we do have a good program. We're using it to solve a certain problem today that's going to create a housing problem that it can also help solve. So while that's not 100% direct and clear, I hope it at least gives you a feel for the problem and the solution that we might have.
Senator Nethercott, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to say thank you. I thought that answer was direct and clear, that the BRC program is an appropriate pathway that has been determined to be constitutional, but having it be focused on housing, as we've identified as those 6 priorities from the Iowa legislation, may be more appropriate in a different type of organization other than the business council. So thank you for that. That's clear to me. But I know that we have, I think there is a question here, and if you know, and using your expertise, so why is it that we have this challenge of attainable housing in Wyoming? Why is the private sector not able to meet the needs across our communities by providing this attainable housing? Do you have a sense as to why the private sector is not delivering on the supply or on the demand? Why they're unable to do the supply for the demand?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Nethercott, one answer is that the market is perfect. And so what I'll say is that if you are a developer and you have a certain amount of investment that you can make to build houses, you're going to go where your investment is going to have the highest ROI. And that means that you're likely going to have the volume required. You're going to have a pretty slick and smooth permitting process. You're going to have land available. That means ultimately, and you're going to have all of those elements together, and those exist in other places and not always in every community in Wyoming. Now, there are communities in Wyoming where there are developments that are happening, albeit not as big as you might see in the Front Range or in Salt Lake or maybe Rapid City, but that's because the money flows to where it's going to make the most money. I think that is probably the best answer I can give. Now, again, my goal, and I think that we're seeing this in some areas, and that's not because of necessarily my agency's work, but we're seeing it in some areas of the state. That is going to change for private developers because of the volume that is going to be required to meet the needs of certain areas of our state with some of the energy growth. That volume is going to change, but again, we're still going to have a good permitting process. We're going to have good zoning. All of those things that factor into a developer's calculus of profit is going to have to be there. And again, what I think the BRC program can do is perhaps make some of those projects more economical by providing the basic infrastructure for those developments. Now, we're likely not going to obviously pay a developer to do that. We don't do that, but we do have community-owned infrastructure, and I think that's where the BRC program can use. Today, I think it's just a matter of economics.
Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Senator Case.
Thanks for coming. I think everybody's kind of getting hammered today. Maybe what we're forgetting is that, the private sector works really well. And it has provided housing for the entire state. I mean, it really has. That's the way we got the housing we are today. Was it always perfect? No. There have been housing crises one after the other. And the government has stepped in, not always successfully, to try to fix those. After World War II, there were lots of housing efforts and there have been housing efforts at different times. It's hard for the private sector to, these are expensive developments. They take time. There's uncertainty. The housing market goes up and down. Interest rates, these are government-driven policies that make it discouraging to developers sometimes. But I don't think we should be so short and frustrated with what the private sector has accomplished and say, well, it's not working right now, let's create a program. I think there's complementariness that we can pursue. And, but to just kind of say, well, it's not working for the private sector, let's move to the public sector from now, when it has worked overwhelmingly. And so I guess that's what the question I'm asking you is, isn't working within that partnership probably our best future? And I see things about Wyoming has unique challenges. A lot of public land in some places, not much private land available. Lack of ability in Cheyenne, we've had situations where, infrastructure and connection and utilities, all these things, they don't quite fit the mix. But isn't this kind of where our future lies, is to kind of assist to bring the private sector to the table? Wouldn't that be our best bet, since they've done such a pretty good job in the past? That's my question.
Yeah, go ahead,
Mr. Chairman and Senator Case, again, I think that's how our program is structured, is to bring the private side to the table, to assist them to make the economics work, and I think work in partnership. And I think there's also something too, and again, I'm looking at a very discrete band within this entire spectrum of housing, right? It's bigger than what I see. And within that, we need to remember that we have a really flexible program with the Business Council that works pretty darn well. And if we can remember that we have a pretty small state, and we can use that to our advantage to not necessarily build a blanket program, again, from my perspective of this discrete band in the spectrum. Not build an overarching program, but look at the issues point by point. We have the programs to do it. We have the capability to do that. We can look at these situations point by point because of our size. We can do that. And that, in my mind, that's the next best step. But again, that's my perspective, and that's me also looking a lot more at my discrete band and not the entire picture. But from my perspective, we need to look at it, utilize the program we have and its flexibility, and utilize it in more laser focus rather than broad spectrum.
Any other questions? Mr. Goldberg, anything? You want to jump in? I know we brought you all the way up here and you haven't got to participate, but are there any programs, strategic partnerships where you find that housing was the number one missing ingredient? I mean, just kind of maybe a sense of when businesses come, I know they're looking for a lot of things. I know housing plays into that, but any specific examples you know of that it was lack of housing? I know that's all coupled together, but
yeah, thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I wouldn't add a lot to what Josh said. When we hear from site location advisors, businesses looking at Wyoming, a lot of times we don't even know they're looking. They look and then they go, and it's very hard to capture that information. We are working on some things. Josh has talked about a lot of things coming that we're very excited about, and I think the ability to understand the site location advisor, what they look for, is going to help us. But to Josh's point, we hear about housing, but we also hear about workforce. We hear about transportation infrastructure, business parks. So it is a wide spectrum of what we hear. It's not just any one thing. Thank you.
yeah. Any other questions for the Business Council while we have them? Not seeing any. All right, thank you very much for coming up.
Yeah. Thank you all.
So committee, we're generally at just public comment. I know Ms. Burkle is here from the My Front Door program and back, and I think where we are, and someone can check me if I'm wrong, we're kind of still looking at the statewide housing trust fund model of Iowa's and other states and seeing if we can make that fit within our constitution and our laws to continue to push towards that effort. And also, I know we have some information on land trust. We can get to that next, if that's another solution. But I thought while we were still kind of on the topic of housing and workforce and how these all come together with labor, that maybe now it's a good time to bring Brenda up and continue that discussion still in the statewide housing trust fund and maybe where she sees, at least in the community she works, if it's, what some solutions and paths forward are, if she needs more support from places like the Business Council, if it's more community support, or where the resources should be coming from. So welcome, Ms. Burke. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I think a statewide housing trust fund is one solution. And I also think that the vast majority of our households, and I can certainly look at the US Census Bureau quick facts to determine exactly where the majority of our household income falls.
Would you introduce yourself and your organization? Sorry.
My apologies to the committee, Mr. Chairman. Brenda Burkle, Executive Director for My Front Door. We are a nonprofit that concentrates on financial literacy and affordable housing. We are also a nonprofit developer. So I think the vast majority of our households, the last time I look at the US Census Bureau's quick facts on poverty, the vast majority of our households across Wyoming really fall between that 30 to 80% of area median income. So that really is our workforce, in essence, right at the moment. I think this can be a very good solution, but I want to be very clear that it is a very broad problem, as our friends at the Business Council just pointed out, and it will require more than one solution and one tool. I think each of those tools can be targeted to alleviate certain effects and to customize problem solutions. The land bank, being one of 3 states that does not have one, for me illustrates that there is some solutions to be found. And I don't know if I'm oversimplifying it, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee and staff. If we have needs of the poor strictly outlined, do we just need to identify the need as housing and identify the AMI as the poor, and it all kind of maths out? Can it be that simple? I do know that when you have households and families that have access to stable, adequate, affordable housing, they have fewer interactions with law enforcement. They have higher educational attainment and college completion, not just entry. They also have, they learn to manage long-term assets. They have more stable retirements. All of that equates to, and health outcomes, healthier when they retire too. And all of that equates to a reduction of a drain on established emergency and supportive systems.
Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, question out of ignorance. When you say land bank, and I've heard that term a number of times, but my instinct is to think of something that makes agricultural loans secured by land, and I don't think that's what you're talking about. What do these land banks actually do? I'm totally unclear on that.
Go ahead, Ms. Bertle.
Mr. Chairman, through you, thank you, Senator Scott. And that is a separate issue from the Housing Trust Fund. And a land bank simply is a way to bank properties that, for by and large, are market rejected. They are vacant, abandoned, or distressed properties that the market has rejected, allows them to be held by an entity and get them back into, and get them market ready into highest and best use. Some of the benefits for that entity would be, of course, not paying taxes until such time as they are sold. In the meantime, they are cleaning those properties up and getting them ready. It, by and large, is infill properties, which means you're not also then creating a drain on resources for the city by adding lane miles or safety and sanitation services. Getting them back into highest and best use also is a benefit for tax purposes. It also raises the property values for the neighborhood in general. Of course, that broken window theory is pretty compelling.
Mr. Chairman, thank you.
Yep. Other questions? So I guess let me ask what you feel is the biggest, let's say, barrier right now, and I assume it's going to be a lack of resources, or whatever the biggest barrier to your program proliferating and helping more people. And I guess my thoughts are, is that something that the Business Council or a government should really be involved in? Is it a private sector? Is it more funds from community? What would be best to encourage where your program's going?
Mr. Chairman, thank you for the question. So we can always use more resources. We never have a lack of use for resources, but for the purposes of land banking, it simply is enabling legislation with no fiscal note that will allow local municipalities to have enter agreements with those organizations or entities that would serve as the authority as a land bank. There are many, many, many communities around the country that have land banking options. Their powers can vary depending on what the goal of the land bank is, whether it's housing in this case or other purposes. Some of them even have eminent domain powers, which I would highly discourage in this particular instance. But there are a wide variety of powers. The benefit is that it removes the liability from the municipality or those that are holding tax delinquent properties, that kind of thing. It removes that liability from them and puts it with the organization that takes this on. As for my organization specifically, I will say that the largest barrier for us is really land. When we look at the cost of land, we saw anywhere from $85,000 to $150,000 per parcel to develop a single family unit. And by the time you add in the labor, materials, and cost of construction, our community land trust couldn't make that math out without some significant subsidies on top of just the land. So this particular land banking option would allow us to acquire land that was otherwise market rejected.
Other questions for Ms. Burkle? Senator Nethercutt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question about the legality or logistics of how a land bank program could work in Wyoming. Ms. Burkle, you indicated that Wyoming would need some enabling legislation to allow a city, town, or county to engage with a nonprofit like My Front Door to participate in this kind of land bank structure. Are you aware, and this might be a question for LSO staff as well, certainly them too, of anything that would prohibit a city, town, or county from entering into some type of an agreement with you for this purpose?
Chairman Zwanitzer, through you. Thank you, Senator Nethercutt. I am not currently aware of any prohibition. I did go to the extent of providing the legislation that Nebraska put forth and what their language is as probably our closest land bank entity. And I did submit that to LSO.
Okay. Follow up, Senator?
No, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Those materials are on the agenda and are available for all committee members too.
Mm-hmm. Anything else, committee? Not seeing any. Thanks for coming all the way up, Brenda.
Thank you. Thank you, committee. Thank you, Chairman.
Other public comment? Come on, yeah. Welcome.
The other day I was told it has to be red for it to be working. Different place, but can't seem to get it straight. My name is Ivy McGowan Castleberry, and I am a policy advisor with Governor Gordon's office. And housing is part of my portfolio. So that means that I get the opportunity to work with all of you wonderful members on this topic. So specifically what I would like to address with you this morning relates back to the question that Senator Nethercutt asked, which is basically, would the Wyoming Business Council be the appropriate home for a housing authority? And in conversations with the governor, he has expressed that he really feels very strongly that the Wyoming Business Council currently has a very carefully focused mission, and that their plates are pretty full working on that mission of activating new economic opportunities. It's also his opinion that the framework and the expertise currently exist for a housing authority within the Wyoming Community Development Authority. There might be some things that we need to tweak, but that expertise and framework really does exist there. We also would agree with Director Durrell that the Wyoming Business Council does have a role in addressing housing. As Director Durrell pointed out, that it really is in helping the communities be able to meet those housing needs, not necessarily taking over and running a housing authority. We feel like that would really dilute their mission, and it would add extra work to them that really detracts from their current mission and focus.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. Question, Senator Nethercott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So many opportunities for legislative strength to be exercised right now, but curious to know, quote, what needs to be tweaked under the WCDA to allow this type of program to move forward, and if anything can be presented to this committee to work with on that front.
Ms. Castleberry, for no.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator Nethercott, at this time, we have not identified anything specific, but we recognize that depending on how the legislation is developed, that there may need to be some tweakings with other statutes that pertain specifically to the Wyoming Community Development Authority as well.
For
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Senator Nethercott, tread lightly, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to tread where I need to tread. I understand that the governor has a task force for housing right now in the state of Wyoming. Is that correct?
Ms. Castleberry.
Chairman Swanson, Senator Nethercott, thank you for that question. Actually, there is a group that has been working together. They have been relatively loosely formed, but it really, my understanding anyway, is that it was initiated by the Wyoming Association of Municipalities, and they have really kind of started driving this conversation. And so this informal group has been meeting and addressing or looking at ways that we can address this issue.
Okay. Further questions from the committee? Not seeing any. Ms. Castleberry? Welcome. Are you still one of the newest members of Governor Gordon's staff? Or if not the newest?
Mr. Chairman, I am one of the newest ones, yes.
Well, excellent. We look forward to having you in corporations for the future.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Other public comment? Oh, sure. Actually, come on up, and then after that, we'll take a 10-minute break. All right. Unless you want us to take the break first, kind of up to you. We'll be in a friendlier, happier mood right after the break.
Okay.
Let's do that, and then we'll get to the WCDA. So how about let's take a 5-minute break, committee, and we'll come back. All right, committee, welcome back. Sorry that was a bit longer break than previously mentioned. Welcome, Scott from WCDA, to talk to us about programs and how we can, there are possibilities to expand and improve and where we can go.
All right. Thank you, Chairman. My name's Scott Hoversland. I'm Executive Director of the Wyoming Community Development Authority. So just want to kind of get up here and let you know, our mission at the Housing Authority is to help fellow Wyoming citizens attain decent, safe, and affordable housing. So that is what our mission is. That's what we're driven for. And the comments by Josh, as far as working together on these programs, I think that's the best way that we can go about these things. They have money, in their wheelhouse where they're trying to get infrastructure and different developments in there. We concentrate on the stick built, the house, putting the house on there, being able to finance those things through the various programs we have. As we talk about those income levels, generally Wyoming WCDA operates in the 80% area median income and below. That is for all we get federal money. We get federal money through the Home Investment Partnership Act program, through low income housing tax credits, through the National Housing Trust Fund, and most recently we added the Community Development Block Grant program that came over from the Wyoming Business Council. So that being able to work in partnership, we've already kind of demonstrated that when we took over the CDBG program. There's a few of those programs that are out there that we're trying to work through that are still under the auspice of Wyoming Business Council, running those. So we're working together to try and, finish those off and get those done up. So we've already been able to demonstrate that the Business Council and WCDA can work together on those types of things. So now as we look at a housing trust fund for the state, it would be the first state funding that WCDA has really received. We were formed in 1975, and I think there was a $200,000 loan that was taken out from the state that was repaid within the first 4 years of having that. And once WCDA was established and start moving on. So that was really the first funding that we have. Now the federal programs are administered by WCDA, and the governor just asks us, or appoints us as the recipients to administer those federal programs. So the legalities, I think we can work out because we've seen all 50 states have a housing authority of some way, shape, or form. And as the LSO staff has shown, is that they're set up differently. Wyoming is an instrumentality of the state. I think when it was initially set up, it was challenged by the Witzenberger case, and that it was a state agency at that time. But WCDA could not do their issuance of bonds and really tie the state into further debt. That's why WCDA had to be an instrumentality, and we issue the tax exempt mortgage revenue bonds, and they are secured by the mortgages that then we purchase with those proceeds. So WCDA is out there as a to help finance affordable, attainable, what it may be. And I think we are able to work in those areas. We talked, and Brenda had talked up to, 120% area median income. We've had different conversations about those types of things. And that's where I think a housing trust fund operated by the state for the needs of the people in Wyoming is probably a good way to head. The Iowa model, which gives a lot of that money, it may be collected, but then it's put out there to local communities, local housing trust funds to be able to put that money to action in their portion of the state where they know what's most needed in those areas. I mean, we've got all areas. I mean, I don't think anywhere in the state of Wyoming right now doesn't have some type of housing problem, whether it be for the workforce or for those people that are actually just trying to attain their first house, to move into a house that they're moving out and moving into something.
So let me ask you a question. You say a housing trust fund operated by the state. Give me a little bit more on what that means to you. Does that mean the business council? Does that mean the state government? Does that just mean a Wyoming instrumentality?
Well, and as a chairman, as the the LSO information, the research that they've done shows that it can be run by any one of those. They're either state agencies, a division of a state agency, an instrumentality like WCDA, or other ones that aren't even operated by that. I would see it, I see WCDA as the experts, in housing, actually financing housing. So, that's where I see it being is housed with WCDA and working in conjunction with the other programs that are out there in state agencies or other state instrumentalities.
So if we were to do it, you want it? I'm not, I'm just
We
trying to.
wouldn't turn it down.
Wouldn't turn it, okay. I'm
I
looking,
mean,
I would like a little more
Yeah,
enthusiasm
no,
if you
it's-
do in
It's another
fact-
one of those tools in the
Yeah.
tool belt to be able to finance, housing in the state.
Okay.
And it comes with more opportunity to finance what Wyoming really needs, how Wyoming needs to finance them.
And in your opinion, you have the parameters, resources, framework to be able to incorporate that in your structure and mission? Or do we need to create a separate entity? Or B, well, I guess A is you can handle it. B is do we need something else? C is you can handle it if we do something to provide additional framework.
Chairman and members of the committee, I think we could handle it. We've taken on the CDBG, we've staffed up for that. We've had to add a couple additional staff to run that program. In looking at a housing trust fund, I mean, without seeing the full parameters of how it's laid out and how it's going to work, yes, I do think we could. It may take an additional staff or two, we may have that, but that's, upon us, whether it's a portion of that money is used for administrative purposes and set out that way. WCDA worked with a lot of other constituents across the state in 2017 through WYONARO, which is the Wyoming branch of the Neighborhood Housing and Redevelopment Officers, Association of Housing and Redevelopment Officers. And there was a active group that got together then that developed the framework for a housing trust fund that then was, we continued to bring forward. And that was the impetus of when the governor asked about ARPA funds, that first request for ARPA funds was for that basis. I mean, which ultimately led to this. So it has been around for a while. We've been, talking about it, pushing it, and it's really come to the forefront now. And I think that is one of the things that, I hope to see out of this is the ability to have a statewide housing trust fund.
When I first came in the legislature, late 70s, and started learning in the early 80s, the business model of the WCDA, basically we defined the problem as the sky-high interest rates were keeping people from affording the mortgages for particularly their first homes. And with the ability to issue those tax-exempt bonds, WCDA was able to solve some of those problems, at least get them a bit of a lower interest rate. And that was the business model of it. We're obviously, our interest rates are now much lower. We've started to come back a little, but we aren't anywhere near the rates that stagflation produced. Could you comment on how the WCDA business model for how you help people has evolved over the years to where it is now? Because I'm unclear as to what extent the original business model still applies and to what extent it is really evolved.
Okay. Yes, Senator Scott, Mr. Chairman, that business model, as you said, Senator Scott, in the early 70s when we first came on and did the WCDA, I think, is noted most for the first-time homebuyer program that we have, which involves issuing tax-exempt bonds, and because they're tax-exempt, hopefully we get lower interest rates from the investors that purchase those. And then we're able to take the proceeds of those bonds and turn around and purchase mortgages from local lenders, you know, that originate the loans. And we purchase those loans, and they also get, you know, we buy the mortgage servicing rights. So we service all mortgages that we have within WCDA. We service here in Casper at our office. We do servicing for about 15,000 of those mortgages. Now, that wasn't something we did when we first started. It was through, you know, various servicers throughout the states. You know, we required that they had brick and mortar shops within the state of Wyoming so that they weren't servicing outside. Part of that model changed with the savings and loan debacle in the early 90s, and that where we had one savings and loan that was going to service out of state because of the resolution trust. Everything that went to the resolution trust, they were going to have to send stuff out of the state. So what happened was the next day that all these loan files ended up on our front door. George Axland was actually the executive director at that time, and they decided to, hey, let's start servicing these loans in Wyoming for all these people in Wyoming. We are the ones that, when mines closed down in Gillette or something, we're able to get there, talk to them, and we know what's happening. If there's a hailstorm, you know, Cheyenne, you know, has hailstorms a lot around the state. We're able to really, you know, talk them through that type of thing. Also, when they have instances where they have, you know, damage to their house, they get that lost draft check from their insurance company. We have to sign it over to them. They're not sending it back to the East Coast somewhere, waiting a month to get that money so they can pay their contractor. So that is one of the things we've taken on, those types of things. But the other thing that we have is, like I said, the federal funds, and that most of the federal funds are steered towards rental housing. So financing for apartment complexes for low to moderate income people. And like I said, all of those are gauged towards 80% AMI and below. So that's the funding that we have from the federal government. And we probably on a yearly basis get approximately $10 million from the federal government through our home program, our our National Housing Trust Fund, and our tax credit program to help assist in building, you know, low-income rental of properties around the state. So that's really been their evolution. And on the mortgage side, on the tax-free bonds that we issue and purchase the mortgages, you know, our toughest time has probably been the last 10 years when interest rates, you know, across the board, if you go and get an FHA loan from the bank versus FHA loan from WCDA, our interest rates were right on top of each other. The thing that we had was we were able to provide down payment assistance for those first-time home buyers to get into those houses up to $10,000. And the program we started in 2016 was to offer $10,000 down payment assistance at 0%, and that the mortgage was actually due upon, you know, sale or refinance of that house. So it wasn't an added cost to them, but it was, they did have another $10,000 that when they sold, they had to, you know, pay back to WCDA. And that's been really the driving impetus of that is that what was holding people back is they didn't have, you know, 20% to put down to get a conventional loan, but they could do an FHA loan. And if they need to put 3% down, then they had the money to put down and pay some of those closing costs. And that's really worked well for us with lower delinquency rates than a lot.
And you've been able to do that because you've been able to make a profit on your operations, and that's where the 10,000 is coming from?
Yes, Chair and Senator Scott, we are able to, with the mortgage revenue bonds, the tax exempt mortgage revenue bonds, you're able to keep a spread of 1 1/8 above what that bond yield is. So if we pay on average for a bond issue, you know, 2.5%, say, we can charge an interest rate for the mortgages at 1 1/8 above that. Now our margin has fluctuated between 0.5% above that and to up to the 1 1/8 above that. But then that we use to help finance our down payment assistance. Plus, right now, we're using some of the bond proceeds because it takes about 2% of a bond issue that we can put into down payment assistance. And then it reduces our yield that we can keep on that.
Okay. Any other questions? Anything else that you think that we should be pursuing in benefit of the WCDA that you don't have available to you?
Not necessarily to benefit the WCA, to benefit the Wyoming citizens, and I think that's where this could come in and really help out in that type of thing, so.
Have you talked to people in other states about land banks? I mean, that's kind of a
Not
topic, and I
the-
think we'll have a motion
Haven't
on
hit
it.
that, Chair, but that is one of the things we have a National Council of State Housing Agencies, and I'm a board member on that also. And so it's a great resource to go to the other states, because to go to those and talk to those about land banks and how it's working in their states to get that information. And actually, I can pull together a lot of that information rather quickly because of that, the work with that group.
Senator Scott.
I need a slight aside. I happen to be chairman of the Revenue Committee, and we're considering a program that would create an authority to provide tax relief. In essence, issue bonds, be income qualified, and then have a private deal where people would be able to get property tax relief. And it would end up being a line of credit, and it would be due when their house is, it'd be a lien on their house and, due when it's sold. Seems like it's reasonably bankable. We could get private banks to administer the program. They'd have to issue bonds. Can I call you offline and talk to you more about how you did that program for the down payment and see if I could learn something from that?
Yep, that would be great. And I'll get you my business card.
Thank you so much.
Yep.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, but thank you.
No problem. Senator Scott?
Mr. Chairman, on the land bank, I can see some need for that. There's a couple places, areas in my district where we do see some derelict properties that have been just abandoned. My question, and I've heard of some of the same in Cheyenne. My question is, in your judgment, do we have enough volume of that sort of thing to support a land bank? It would seem to me that you'd need some volume to support the overhead and whatnot if we went that route.
Go ahead, Mr. Rubin.
Yeah, Senator Scott, Chairman, that is one of the, I do not know for sure. I mean, that's one thing that we would have to, we could look into, and I'll work with Brenda on looking into that, together and trying to find out information on that. As I, dig into what other states have and look also at what is the size of their program. Again, Wyoming being the smallest state, sometimes, because of sheer efficiencies, it doesn't always work, but that would be one thing, we can look into.
So I don't mean to be repetitive, but so in other states, when we talk about these issues, their land bank function is housed in a similar entity as the WCDA, and you would feel comfortable if it went all the way through and land banking was an option to be part of your arsenal?
And Mr. Chair, that is one of the things about 8 years ago when David Haney was the executive director. He kind of looked at a land bank model and kind of reviewed. I mean, it never came to fruition. And it is one thing that we have looked at. And, if it was something and it seemed like a plausible deal, I could see it being something that we would definitely look at.
Representative Clausen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So when they do these land banks, how do you, or not you personally, but in other states, how do they decide the purchase price of the derelict properties? That seems to be the biggest risk factor in something like a land bank, because that could be up to interpretation by square foot, or you could have something that's completely condemned, or, I mean, the variables in there are just extraordinary. Is there some sort of a equation or something that's used, or?
Mr. Chair, Representative Clausen, I wouldn't be the one to ask that. I mean, I don't know for sure, and we can look at that. Maybe Brenda has the answer to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Clausen, the way the properties come into a land bank can vary. For example, where there is a deceased homeowner with no apparent heirs, that kind of thing, a land bank can take that on, do the quiet title, do all of the necessary paperwork to get that into a land bank, and then back into highest best use. A land bank would also have the ability to extinguish tax liens and those kinds of things. So the mechanisms can be many and varied. It just depends on what properties present themselves. And also, as far as volume, typically land banks aren't necessarily through a housing authority. I mean, they can be. They can also be directly through the municipalities. The typical arrangement is for a land bank that is set up with that specific intent and is through an organization who then takes the liability away from other stakeholders.
Go ahead, Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, so basically the land bank business model is you're dealing with properties that, as they sit, may have even a negative net value, and by being able to take them over, get the tax liens extinguished because the value isn't there, and it's uncollectible under the circumstances, get some of those things. It's a device in part where a municipality can clean up that kind of problem and eventually wind up with a property that is saleable.
Mr. Chairman,
Am I understanding what's going on properly?
Mr. Chairman, through you, absolutely. It is typically an instrument used by nonprofits, and our profit is our passion to get those properties back to highest best use. And in this case, would serve the purpose of low to moderate income housing. So they would be developed or redeveloped. Of course, the consideration or the what the municipality gets out of it is low to moderate income or workforce housing.
Any other questions for Ms. Burkle while I have her, or Mr. Hoverland? Not seeing any. Thank you both for being here. Don't go too far. I think we'll have maybe some motions here in a second. Back to public comment. Realtors are in the back. Welcome, Ms. Overkite.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Lori Orbikite. I'm representing the Wyoming Realtors and the Wyoming Housing Alliance, which is the trade association for modular and manufactured housing. So I don't have a lot of prepared comments for you today because I think we discussed at great lengths in Hewlett what the problem is. We all know what the problem is. We need some workforce housing across the state of Wyoming, and what is the part or the role that the state government can play. But there were a couple questions that I did want to answer before I get off on my tirades. And one of them was asked in Hewlett by Representative Clausen regarding institutional buyers, and were they part of the problem in running up the cost of housing in Wyoming? And the National Association of Realtors did using data from the American Community Survey, analyzed it, and what they found is that institutionalized buyers nationwide make up 13% of the residential sales in 2021, 13%. But they aren't running up the price. Ironically, the median purchase price of institutional buyers is 26% lower than the median prices bought by individuals. So despite what a lot of people have heard and believe, that corporations or large companies are coming in and buying up the properties and therefore upping the costs, they're actually going into areas where they can get those properties, and they're usually distressed properties as well, at a much lower rate. So I wanted to share that information. I have the whole study. If any of you would like it, I'd be happy to share it with you. And then there was a question regarding manufactured housing and what its role could be in this. We believe firmly that manufactured housing certainly could be a solution to a lot of this. Why we're not seeing more, and we call them land lease units now, instead of trailer courts, we call them land lease communities. In 1974, Congress passed the National Manufactured Housing Construction and Safety Standards Act. In that act, they prohibited, there is a federal preemption on any municipality or county governmental unit discriminating against HUD code built homes. HUD homes are built to the standards set in that act, and it has been updated several times through the years, most recently in 2000. And so there is this federal preemption that municipalities cannot discriminate based on the construction standards. Now, what can municipalities do? They can regulate size, they can regulate density, they can regulate aesthetics, i.e. the pitch of the roof. When I first started the Manufactured Housing Association, I spent a lot of time on the road talking to municipalities, helping them understand that their flat denial of a manufactured home built to the HUD code in a residential subdivision was prohibited by the federal government regulation. And many of the communities have changed and updated their ordinances, but they do have the ability to regulate them based on appearance, on the size. They have that right, they have that authority. And I think that's what's happened in a lot of instances. It was an issue for many years, getting HUD code manufactured homes financed. That is not an issue anymore. There are plenty of financing options available. And certainly the ironically, modular homes now, which are built to the International Building Code and normally are adapted, built and specific to the local building code, because each municipality can adopt parts or all of the International Building Code as they see fit. So when a modular home comes into the state of Wyoming, they know where it's going. They send the plans and specs to that local municipality for their approval, to make, just as any new building would be done. So in Wyoming currently, we are having many, many more modular homes being shipped into the state than manufactured houses, which from the outside, you would never know the difference, because it's basically the foundation is the differentiation. So I wanted to touch base on that with the manufactured housing. There is, in some communities, accessory dwelling units have been contemplated in their zoning ordinances. While those certainly, I think they serve a great purpose for a variety of reasons. One, if people can add an accessory dwelling unit, and what we're talking are tiny houses. Sorry, tiny houses. Tiny houses on their lot, if they have a large enough lot, and if the excuse me, and if the zoning ordinances will allow them, that they can use them as a rental to help them pay for their house and to help minimize the cost of the skyrocketing real estate taxes. So they're good for that. They're good for mother-in-law or father-in-law dwellings, and they can be just a rental to help alleviate that pressure on the rental market that we have currently. So those are some options. But back to the reality of the situation and why we are all here today, what is the role that the state of Wyoming can play? I think you've heard a lot of really great ideas, and my favorite one is that we tweak that Business Ready Communities program, whether it's through the Business Council or via the SLIB board is fine with me. I don't care where it goes, but tie it to workforce housing. And then you're going to have to insert some deed restrictions, is my belief. And I know that's not something free market people like to hear, but the reality is, if we are creating workforce housing and we want it to continue to be workforce housing, the only way to do that is through deed restrictions. Now, should they be allowed to make some profit on it? Well, of course. We do want people to gain some wealth from owning homes. But if they're getting that house at a lower cost because the state of Wyoming has chipped in to build the infrastructure, then, you know, there's trade-offs. So I think some deed restrictions may be needed in that instance. But then I think the best part of that whole concept is that the state could use it as a carrot to reward those municipalities or counties, if they have zoning ordinances in the counties and they're contemplating workforce housing in the county, to implement changes to their regulations and their rules that have been impediments to workforce housing. I think that's the role that the state of Wyoming can take. You could encourage, obviously you can't tell a municipality what their zoning ordinances should or should not be, but you can certainly encourage them by allowing them to apply for business-ready community or housing-ready community programs to help with their infrastructure. I firmly do not believe that the Wyoming legislature is in any mood to grow government in any shape or form. And so I think utilizing an existing program is probably the best bet to get started on this right away. And I'd be happy to try and answer any questions.
Sure, go ahead, Representative Klaus.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Erbkite. So the 13% institutional buyers, 20% under the market price. Do we have any baseline? Is this an anomaly for 2021, or do we have years past? Or I know I give you these hardest questions, but
No, that's okay.
I was curious because there's some stock market things that would have played into this in 2021 that or could possibly play into it, or is that a standard baseline, I guess would be my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, the full report is like 80 pages long, I believe. And I do recall seeing that institutional purchased 13.2% of the rental properties in 2021, and that was up from 2020, it was only 11.8%. It is the rising cost of rentals that attract them the most. Most of these properties are used as rentals, and they want to buy property in areas that have high rental and high income. But I'll get you this entire thing.
Mr. Chairman, exploring the mobile home, whatever you call them these days. So the feds prohibit discrimination against ones that are built to their standards. But they do allow certain things. In your experience, are the local communities using some of those size and other things they can put in their zoning to discriminate against these houses?
Mr. Chairman, in most of the community zoning ordinances, they actually have a mobile home park kind of zoning area so that they can restrict those units into those park areas. And I haven't seen any indication that any of those have expanded or that any new ones have been developed in and around Wyoming in quite some time. So yes, and they can restrict size. So a lot of the units that you would see, and in Cheyenne, there are several really nicely done land lease communities where the people own the units, and some of them, the company owns the unit and the land, and they just rent the whole thing. But some of them, the people actually buy the property or buy the units, and then they lease the space. There are some really nice ones in the Cheyenne market. But they are normally, in order to keep the cost minimal, those lots are very small. And the units are usually what most people will remember are single wides. They're just a single unit. not a multiple unit. And so to get them out of a mobile home park or a land lease community, then the municipalities normally require width, a wider, so that it has to be a 2-unit, double wide, or whatever you want to call it, 2 units or 3. And that's how they restrict them. It's based on size, and roof pitch is hugely, that's one of the things that a lot of municipalities use to restrict manufactured housing, because it's much cheaper not to have a steep pitched roof. Although it can be done now, since I don't recall for sure when we started the Manufactured Housing Association, but in the years since we've been doing this, they have hinged roofs, so you can have a very steep pitched roof if you really want one. There used to be issues with the snow load. That's no longer an issue. Manufactured housing can take care of that. So the units have evolved, yes, but it's the size restriction of the unit itself and the lot size that stops the expansion of those.
So by size restriction, you mean they're requiring to be larger?
Mr. Chairman, yes, exactly. And on a larger lot.
Another one?
Mr. Chairman,
Keep going.
should we, the state, forbid some of those practices? And would we make a significant contribution to solving the problem if we did restrain the governments from doing that sort of thing?
Mr. Chairman, from the very beginning of my involvement with manufactured housing communities, one of the things that a lot of states have is a state building code and state, and they do restrict what municipalities and counties can and cannot do. Just because I was born and raised in Wyoming, I just can't go there with that. I think the local municipalities should have control. But again, if we had a program that would encourage infrastructure, help pay for infrastructure, and preference is given to those municipalities who have taken a hard look in the mirror and figured out maybe we need to reassess how we treat manufactured housing, you know, that carrot stick thing, I think, works. And I have to agree with Senator Case's statement earlier. Private enterprise has worked. Private builders, you know, the developers, it does work. We're at an odd situation now because of the rising prices versus our incomes are not rising that high for key people in our communities. Yes, we're bringing in new jobs and big and good paying jobs, but that doesn't increase the salaries of the teachers or the police officers that need housing in our communities. So I think the carrot and the stick thing, I'm still with that one. I just, you know, I don't think you could probably get legislation passed that would say, we're going to tell municipalities what they can and cannot zone. But I'll be happy to
A
watch.
challenge for this body. Representative Duncan, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Rickheit, isn't also another issue with the manufactured homes, the fact that a lot of our lower income people or a lot of people enter the market, they get in and then they can't resale and they can't, once the property or once the, it has to do with lenders and such. Can you explain that for us?
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Representative Duncan. So in the past, I mean, in 20 years ago, lending was a huge issue for manufactured housing, for the HUD code homes, but it is not now. And we have study after study after study that show that manufactured housing does not decline in value. It's the same as any other well-built home. It will appreciate if well-maintained, and so there is that stigma when you talk about manufactured housing, but I will tell you, today's manufactured houses and the modular houses, you would not know the difference of them between those and a site-built home. They're just, you know, they are not the 1970s mobile home anymore. So I think a lot of that is more perception than it is reality, because they are increasing in value, and they do appreciate the same as any other. And there is really no reason that if they are placed on a permanent foundation, there shouldn't be adequate funding available.
Follow-up, Representative Duncan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Eberkeit, maybe I'm confused because my lenders in my area, I'm struggling with, I'm actually struggling with that because at a certain age, my lenders aren't lending and people are having to pay cash for these mobile homes. And then there's a lot of restrictions. There's a lot of engineering reports that are having to be done to ensure that they're on correctly on a permanent foundation. What is a permanent foundation and things like that versus the modulars. Modulars, there's no question. They're treated just like a stick-built home. But the mobile homes is what I'm struggling with in terms of the people being able to grow with wealth. So can you explain to me, because that's what I'm struggling with lenders in that scenario.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Duncan, indeed, to qualify for the 30-year mortgages that are available for stick-built or site-built homes, they do have to be on an engineered foundation, and that is a critical piece. And if when they were first brought in, they were not placed on an engineered foundation, then it's going to be an issue finding secondary financing or the second sale financing or third or however many times. But the reality is that if the manufactured housing industry wants to be treated on equal footing with the site-built housing, then they have to have engineered foundations the same as any site-built home. Now, the foundations don't look like a site-built foundation, but they are engineered, and and every manufacturer has the specifications to do them right. And so it's unfortunate if homeowners did not do it right the first time around, and now they're trying to resell, and it's causing difficulties. I'd be happy to visit with you more offline regarding where some of those programs are that might be of assistance.
Good. Okay. Anything else we should be doing in the state of Wyoming to proliferate?
Mr. Chairman,
attainable housing?
I really haven't delved in deeply to the land trusts. I think I think helping with the infrastructure through grants from the state specifically for workforce housing or attainable housing is probably the best thing that the state of Wyoming can do. And through that, using that carrot to the municipalities to encourage them to take that deep look in the mirror and find out who's causing or what regulations they may have implemented that are causing these issues.
Further questions from the committee? The realtors? Seeing none. Thank you much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Further public comment on housing issues? Come on down.
Yes, Joel Highsmith, Mayor, Town of Shoshone, also on the Board of Directors of WHAM, Board of Directors of FCAG and Wind River Visitors Council. And housing is an issue on every one of those boards. FCAG meeting was yesterday, and that was part of our discussion. But I would like to give the Wyoming Business Council, they have recently awarded Shoshone a $1.6 million approximate award, 95.5 grand on a business ready grant that include housing. That would enable the the business to build 8 duplexes. And it would also allow the town of Shoshone, we have a 40-acre subdivision we're working on to help run sewer line towards that. But that was a big part of our award. And so the state is, is SLIB and the Wyoming Business Council have recognized, I think housing is a problem because we got to have housing if we're gonna bring jobs. I know we have a local developer that just approached our council, our last meeting, to purchase some city-owned land and wants to work with the city on that, maybe at a reduced cost to build 2 stick-built single dwelling homes, 1,500 to 1,800 square feet, and also a duplex. That they plan to turn that into a rental. So I like the terminology of attainable housing because it's not all home ownership. But it can also be rentals. I just believe that the state needs to continue, and I believe the legislature is recognizing that we do have a housing problem statewide. Who'd ever thought we'd really have one in Shoshone? But we do. But what got me involved with this was trying to provide housing for school employees and city employees. It got me down this road to make the housing attainable for those employees. But what's brought us here, this trust fund may be another tool in the toolbox to help if it's properly managed and gets the right direction. It looks like to me it could be, but it needs to be right. And keep in mind, I think, give municipalities the ability to raise funding themselves and have skin in the game and be part of it too. Because it's easy to look at the state and with our hands out and, and try to solve all the world's problems. You don't have that much money to do that, and be honest, but teamwork. But what we're just, this last grant we got from SLIB and worked through the business council was a combination of municipality, so local bit, and the business and the state as a team putting that together. And I think we can do a lot if we continue to do that. And thank you for what you do.
Questions from Mayor Highsmith? Not seeing any, Mayor. Thanks for coming over.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor.
Other public comment on housing? Vice Mayor Jorgensen, welcome.
Thank you, committee. Thank you, Chair. I'm Vice Mayor Arn Jorgensen with the town of Jackson. Thank you once again for the opportunity to address this joint committee, and thank you for your service to the state of Wyoming. As our Mayor Morton Levinson expressed to you in Hewlett, here primarily to express gratitude and to support the work of this committee and the presenters today in really digging into these issues which we see across our state. This topic is a persistent challenge in our community. It's something that we are fortunate to have many organizations and individuals working on this. This work is done through various developments that house our firefighters, police officers, teachers, hospital employees, and so many more, utilizing a wide variety of tools to meet different needs. There are a wide range of products, tools, depending on income ranges, that are addressed, which highlight the entire spectrum of housing. I think it's important to highlight comments that have been made today that really stress this continuum of need. And it looks very different within our communities and from community to community. I'm intrigued by the solutions discussed today about the land bank, the State Housing Trust Fund, and would encourage the discussions around infrastructure investment. I would also include land. In some of our communities, land also provides, access to land provides barriers. And before I close, I just wanted to acknowledge Senator Case's comments earlier about the property tax issues and about the relief. There is a strong, strong connection between levels of affordability and the stresses that we see in many, many of our communities between those issues. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thank you again for looking at this problem that affects people across the state, families across the state, and stand for any questions. Thank you.
Questions for the Vice Mayor of Jackson? Certainly housing crunch issues up there. I was reading a couple of websites that they're from all sorts of national associations, but they're saying really the number one issue isn't even labor, capital, workforce. It's, well, I guess what's commonly known as NIMBYs, that they don't want attainable housing near them, and they believe it'll decrease property values. And certainly I've heard anecdotal things from your community that may be an issue. Would you say that's an issue in your community? And is there a way to solve that portion? That some of it's not government funding or regulation or anything we can do, some of it is public perception and public outcry?
Chairman, I very much appreciate that question. Certainly it's an issue. I think the biggest way you push back on that is strong leadership by local government. In Teton County, both at a commissioner level as well as the town of Jackson, there is a strong, strong commitment to step up and put in place additional density. We have, was mentioned earlier, public comment about accessory residential units. We have that across the town of Jackson. Every lot in the town of Jackson is permitted to, unless a homeowner association has said no, to do that. We have looked at streamlining development approvals for community workforce housing. So, and all of that comes with some of that pushback. And I think it really is a matter of being able to step up and say, there is a larger community goal here that's important, that we're providing units that are being that are housing members of our community that are doing these jobs that I referenced earlier. So it's always an issue. We're facing one right now in Teton County. We had a meeting about it, I guess it was only last Monday. And that was a significant issue. And it was, to be quite blunt, one of the times, I'm fairly even keeled, but it was one of the times that I was pretty blunt and sharing some concerns and pushback. And I think that's incumbent on us as elected leaders to do that when we run up against that.
Question for the Vice Mayor? Senator Case?
Go ahead. Mr. Chairman, question I have, there was mention of homeowners association. Are we getting real problems with homeowners associations and private covenants that are preventing development of reasonable housing? Is that an area we need to explore?
Chairman, Senator Scott, you know, in Teton County or in the town of Jackson, not so much. I mean, I mentioned it relative to the accessory residential unit. There are not that many of them that have that in place. And I would anticipate that they have those kind of prohibition in place. You know, I am struck by the irony because I believe it's California that put in place a state law that overrode all of those kind of situations. And I would be loath to suggest that we'd want to follow in those footsteps, particularly at a statewide level. I know there are a couple of homeowner associations in the town of Jackson that I personally have begun some discussions with, just on a one-to-one, to try to work through if there are ways that we can provide some more opportunities there. But from a regulatory standpoint, it's not one that I'm seeing a particular barrier within our community.
How about any barriers to manufactured housing? Tell me what you experience and what the thinking is and things like that.
It's a really good question. I'm an architect by training, that's my job. It's my other job, right?
Yeah.
And so I'm very familiar with that. We do not have size limitations that were referenced earlier. We don't do that. If you are meeting the comment on the foundation is absolutely critical. We need to have, particularly when a seismic situation, those are taken into account in manufactured homes today. I would say within our community, probably, and I'm not as familiar with, probably one of the things that we'd be looking at would be energy code requirements, which again is part of the International Building Code pool, and we have adopted those. I'm not familiar off the top of my head on the manufactured homes, how that comes into play. You know, we are actively looking at, well, and I would say within our community, a traditional manufactured home scenario doesn't provide the level of density we're looking for. We're looking at higher density as solutions. So I think I want to be a little careful of kind of falling into that. And that being said, we are absolutely open to different technologies and construction types within particularly modular home industry on multifamily housing. And we have a couple of developers that are spending a lot of time looking into that. And we're very open to that. One of the things that we're looking at from a permitting review standpoint is making sure that those buildings are built to the appropriate codes. Those manufacturers are structured to do that, and just making sure we have alignment there has been something that our building department has raised a question about.
And I assume you're kind of have the same standards. So these either manufactured homes or modular units of some kind could be an accessory dwelling unit? Is that possible? Would that be a good idea?
Chairman, yeah, absolutely. And in my mind, it is, again, it's got to meet those engineering codes.
No problem.
And I'm hoping I'm not misspeaking here, but that's my recollection of that accessory residential. It's got to meet those codes. I will go back and look at that now that you're asking me the question whether we're required under the IRC, the International Residential Code, or not. But I will go back and look at that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And you might talk to Ms. Oberkeit on your way out the door. I'm sure
I suspect we will.
I think she'll be circling for you.
Representative Duncan, floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I don't want to put you on the spot if there's issues, but my question is when circling back to Mr. Chairman's question about the NIMBY, you have a situation in one particular subdivision where a private entity was willing to do the entire project for workforce housing. They took the property that was formerly a senior housing and they were going to turn it into workforce housing. And the neighbors and the housing development decided, no, that wasn't what they wanted. And everybody in the community says, yes, 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 we need workforce housing. It was going to be fully funded by private industry. So in that situation, you do have a situation where people are not willing to follow through. I keep hearing of a couple situations like that, as well as lot sizes increasing rather than decreasing for allowing more dense population to solve some of that issue, as well as we keep hearing about only allowing 2 stories versus 3 stories so that you can have a denser construction to be able to make for the developers to actually break even or to even make money to be able to do that. So why do we keep having this issue that the government, local government, seems to have the restrictions here when private is willing to foot the bill? So can you explain to me why we keep coming back and circling back to this issue? Are there any conversations with that?
Mr. Jorgensen, it's fun being an elected official, right, and representing all sides. We're all aware. So
thank you, Chair.
Thoughts?
I enjoy it. Thank you. Representative Duncan, I really appreciate those questions, and I hope I'm capturing all of them. I think I may have missed one, so please remind me if I don't address them. The first point that you were mentioning is actually in the county, so it's not one that we're particularly involved in. It has to do with some master plan approval in that particular subdivision, extending back, if I remember right, the late 70s, early 80s. I think there was a really intriguing project there. I suspect it will move forward in some context. I don't want to try to predict how that does. I will suggest in the earlier public comment, which was intriguing, about the notion of deed restrictions. The notion of, if we're talking about these kind of housing units and we're investing, and it's not just resources, it's also political capital. The public, or the comment they've just made about the local elected officials being willing to make this step. and making sure that those units stay affordable over time. And that's an important tool. And I believe that was an issue that they were trying to work through on that particular project. But I don't have a lot of the detail on that because it was in the county. You know, the town of Jackson specifically, we have increased densities. We continue to do that. Our zoning is structured into, in our residential zoning, stable and transitional neighborhoods. And we've identified areas in town that are in transition where we're willing to accept a significant change in the built environment, including going up to 3 stories. 2 stories are limited in those stable neighborhoods. There's a significant part of town, I can't think of off the top of my head what that percentage looks like, but our current town council and our current land development regulations do allow significant increase in density within much of the community within Jackson. And again, I think I may have missed one of your points, Representative Duncan.
Representative Duncan, any follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, Mr. Jorgensen, that you guys have started coming to the table and actually have started having some conversations. My history on this committee, there's been some roadblocks. So I do want to commend you and your current council coming to the table and actually trying to work on solving some of these issues instead of just throwing money at the problem. So I really look forward to maybe you guys continuing to expand some of those, breaking down some of those regulation barriers. So I look forward to seeing what happens, but thank you.
Further questions to the Vice Mayor? Senator Scott.
Mr. Chairman, Jorgensen mentioned earlier seismic risk, and I know geologically his community and some of the other communities on the western part of the state have a degree of seismic risk that the rest of the state simply doesn't have. My question for him is, do you have any general rules of thumb or information as to what dealing with that seismic risk that you have to do does to the price of developing housing in your part of the world?
Go ahead, Mr.
Chairman, Senator Scott. It's not insignificant, and there are different criteria. So within the building codes, it's a more conservative standard than the manufactured homes, as I understand it. Both of them need to meet that need. The vast majority of the structures that are being built to the building code, the level of criteria has gotten more stringent. Again, this is a national standard. It's gotten more stringent over the years because there's been more of a focus shifting from life safety to include structure protection. So after there's an event, trying to preserve the integrity of that structure rather than having to go back in and invest in rebuilding the structure. And this shift started, if I remember right, in 1994 after the Northridge earthquake in Southern California, where there was a huge amount of demand or a huge amount of damage, very little life lost. But the industry and the code started to addressing structure protection. That has led to a significant increase in housing or in construction costs. I will say, though, in smaller units, which most of the units we're talking about in this discussion are, you're able to accommodate that fairly effectively. It gets to be more of an expense when you deal with larger structures, larger spans, and those kind of uses. So while it does have an impact, I wouldn't say it's a dramatic impact when we're dealing with smaller units.
Follow it up.
By smaller units, you mean this sort of thing that would be an average starter house size as opposed to a commercial establishment? Is that the sort of thing? What do you mean by a smaller unit?
Mr. Chair, Senator Scott, absolutely. So in residential and smaller residential, by nature, you're dealing with a structure that has smaller rooms, more walls. Walls provide stability and strength in a seismic event. So when you get into larger residential units, and I'm thinking 3,000 to 4,000 square feet or larger, or commercial, where you get to be larger spaces, or in our community and many communities in the state of Wyoming, where you're opening up large expanses to see the views, because that's one of the reasons you're there, you start adding costs. So it is real. And then I would also say Representative Duncan's question about stories and height, obviously the taller you get, you also start getting more additional increase in cost because that increases the complexity of that structural system.
Other questions for the Vice Mayor? Not seeing any. Thanks for sticking around today.
Thank you so much.
Our TVs just went.
We're done.
We are, other people on workforce housing, on attainable housing. Other public comments? Make sure there's no one online real quick. I think they've all disappeared, but nobody has their hand raised. So we'll close public comment. Committee, Representative Clausen, you want to kick us off? Sure, it's all you.
Mr. Chairman, just a thought when we come into this land banks, and I know we have some expertise from the Revenue Committee here, but maybe we should take a peek at the mechanism to get rid of our tax debt while our tax liens on some of these derelict properties. Because and I'm going to go out on a limb because I don't understand it completely, but I think it takes 5 years of paying the back taxes to pick up some of these derelict properties if you're a private individual, and then you have to buy them at auction. That may be something to look at before we go to this pure land bank, because 5 years of degradation, if there's a roof problem or waters or so on and so forth, that may just be an avenue that we could take a peek at, just bringing that up for conversation.
Any thoughts on that, Senator Case or other Revenue Committee members? I don't know, mostly it's individuals who pick up some of those derelict properties from property tax auctions, but I don't know if there's other ways to allow entities to pick those up or have the government speed up that process. And we certainly have some in Laramie County, in my community, that yeah, when we've tried several bills over the past 10 years, I know Representative Byrd brought some to try to force properties to go against the owner's will, and we decided that was not the government's role at that time. But if you see any way forward, Senator Case?
Mr. Chairman, the traditional property tax sales, when they have a long timeline, it's a process designed to make sure that the taxes get collected as this whole thing goes through. You know, they have you actually can be delinquent for quite some time before your property's put up to the auction. And then most auctions go, it's kind of a random event where a bunch of people in the room offered to bid, and then just getting it in the auction is only the beginning of your journey, because it takes several years and advertisement and to go from that to actually get to where you have a title to the land or the property and do something with it. The journey from the beginning to the end is like 5 years, and I'm not exaggerating. Is there a way to speed that up? There's lots of court stuff about people's rights when they owe these taxes, and in order to lose your property, it's a big deal in America, and it's hard to do. There might be, as I recall, the program that I believe it was Representative Byrd was trying to help us with, there might be in this whole thing a way to make it a more voluntary, where the owner of the property voluntarily gives it up for some kind of compensation, that's a better deal than just losing it through the tax sales. And then it's more like a sale than a tax procedure. And I imagine it could proceed right along. So the question is, what would that take? Finding the person with the distressed property, saying, hey, let's not go this route. Let's find a way to make you happy. And it sounds like the private sector could do that now, but I'm not sure they're thinking about it. Anyway, sorry, that was just off the top of the head.
All right, so committee, we still have the topic of a housing trust fund. We did hear that there would be some interesting drafting, but it is achievable. If you'd like to see that at our October meeting, what that looks like. certainly talked about land banking if we want to pursue that and perhaps give it to the WCDA as an option or a tool in the toolbox, or at least have a bill draft to that effect. I didn't hear any other interesting suggestions on legislation that we should be pursuing, but certainly happy to take up any bill drafts that the committee would like to pursue. Senator Nethercott, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would move that we adopt a bill draft based on the Nebraska statutes for how they do land banks there.
Is that a second?
No, it's a question.
Oh, is there a second to the motion? Sure, I'll second it. Senator Scott, question.
Mr. Chairman, do you mean adopt draft or do you mean request a draft?
Request a draft. A motion for, I move for LSO to do a bill draft for a land bank based on the Nebraska statutes.
In committee, I do believe Senator Nethercott emailed us all a copy of the statutes of Nebraska on how they make it work. I did second that. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing no discussion, all in favor of that motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. I think that motion passes. Other motions from the committee. Would anyone like to move for a statewide housing trust fund? Senator Nethercott, your hand's still up, so.
Thank you. I'll just take the floor. You know, I think that at this point, it's probably too challenging to do. But I'll go ahead and do it. I'd move for a state housing trust fund bill draft based on, and have it be within, based on the language is found for the Business Ready Community Grant Program, but placed within the WCDA. Is that specific enough for LSO, or am I going to get another memo?
Let me second that. And again, LSO is there. It's attainable to draft a constitutional version of a statewide housing trust fund for Wyoming.
Mr. Chairman, yes, I think that's enough information.
Okay. Committee discussion on that motion. It might be a little bit of work over the next 6 weeks, but you'll see a very lengthy draft, hopefully, and we'll hopefully have it read through before we get to the meeting. Senator Scott, discussion?
Chairman, discussion. I am at this point unpersuaded and a no vote on this bill ultimately. I think the private sector is capable of solving these problems, especially if there is some assistance by the local communities in looking at their procedures for approving it, their requirements for approving it. I think there's some barriers there. So I am a profound skeptic on this bill. I think we may ultimately, and I don't think we're there yet, we may ultimately need to look at some of the infrastructure needs, particularly in the water area. But this one leaves me cold. I think we're maybe rewarding some of the practices that are restricting private sector abilities.
Other discussion on the bill draft?
And Mr. Chairman, if I might, thank you. If I might, as part of the discussion, yeah, I don't know if it's going to move forward as for the committee to adopt either. I do think in light of it being one of our priority topics that this committee has chosen to take up, and hearing the overwhelming testimony from May, which I know we've all forgotten that there is an attainable housing concern, that at least we will have something tangible to work on at some meeting. And unfortunately, it will be our last. And so in light of the challenges we have seen and the concerns presented, I doubt it will move forward, but I do think it's important we have something tangible to see and work off, if not for this interim, but perhaps for the next, to understand how to move forward more thoughtfully. And I would encourage the governor's office, the Business Council, Wyoming Community Development Authority to all work with LSO in identifying the nuances associated with that programs, so that bill draft might be ready to go.
Okay, further discussion. All those in favor of the motion to have a bill draft at our October meeting for Statewide Housing Trust Fund, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, say no. No. Let me just get a show of hands then. All in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. All opposed? Oh, 5. Okay, all opposed? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That motion did not pass. Are there other motions related to housing issues or attainable housing issues that you would like to pursue on this committee? It is one of our prime topics. Ms. Taub, or Senator Nethercott, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And if this is out of order, that's fine. I do recall Mr. Doral mentioning a number of times concerns regarding the permitting process for some of these housing developments, and wondering if he could speak more directly to that now for us to potentially brainstorm and the other stakeholders in the room to identify maybe more specifically what that is in reference to.
CEO Doral, come on back. Thanks for sticking around for a couple hours with us. I'm just making sure you heard Senator Nethercott's question and any response.
Yep, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Senator Nethercott, yeah, I can only provide anecdotal information there. We haven't done any sort of exhaustive research on how long permitting takes or what best-in-class permitting looks like, which I think is what we would look at, right? From this to this in some amount of time is how we would look at that. So I can tell you that the discussions I've had either with cities about that or with the private folks is that it can be an onerous part. And what happens is, and I believe others on the committee mentioned this, it changes the level of certainty that they have around things like the interest rates. It changes the level of certainty they have about starting and supply chains. And so I think that the general topic is that permitting and sort of those regulations need to be as smooth as possible for developers. That's probably the blanket statement I would make.
Mr. Chairman, follow up?
Another cut, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, no doubt, certainly in a Republican state, that having that permitting process be as smooth as possible is key. Is there any specific concerns that you have heard about any type of specific permitting challenges that have inhibited this growth in this area?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Nethercott, not specifically, except the timing. I mean, the time it takes, that's required. Now, what I will also add is that, again, anecdotally, that most of the time the timing complaints from the private developers are met with capacity complaints from the building inspectors or the folks who are doing that type of work within the city government.
Any follow-up? Okay. Any other questions for the Business Council CEO while I have him up again? And any other statutory barriers you're facing that we don't have in other states, or while I have you one more time, any areas that we can help buffer this area of housing, even if it's not directly related to your agency, but things that we could be doing at a state legislative level besides continued appropriations to BRC and some others? But if you would kind of go back and look at business-ready communities, and if there are housing-related specifics that you think we need to, that's probably more program rules and regs than it is maybe our level, but certainly let us know if there are any.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right, one last call, committee. Any other bill drafts you want to see for October meeting on housing? We'll have some election fund, some PBM, some more alcohol, and at least land trusts. So, all right, with that, we'll move on unless there's any other public comment on housing. I know I closed it, but I got 20 more people in the room. You're all here for telecom, I assume. Great. All right, so the question is, do you want to take a lunch, or do you think we can get through telecom? Just had two people decide opposite end of the spectrum. Everybody, I think we're taking lunch. Is that? Senator Case?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'm always worried, telecom is on the agenda for 1 o'clock, and I'm sure they're very wise and don't miss stuff like this, but there might be one lost telecom lobbyist out there.
We are always looking for one more telecom lobbyist. I do want to shout out to Representative Sweeney, Representative Wash in the back of the room from here in Natrona County. Thank you for having us in your hometown, and thank you for attending our meeting today. And maybe we'll see you back after lunch to talk telecom. But you're right, because it does say 1 o'clock, just in case there were some members of the public who might want to attend, we probably should take lunch. So with that, committee, let's come back at 1:15 to talk telecom, and we'll be in recess until then.